history.
Recording in progress.
And the history of American boarding schools and missing and murdered Indigenous women. Heather is a doctoral student at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay, where she studies First Nations education, focusing on creating inclusive narratives for teaching. Heather is a public historian, activist, and independent consultant who works with institutions and organizations for Indigenous sovereignty and collective liberation. Heather, we are so delighted to see you. Thank you for joining us. I turn this over to you. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ooh, I'm
Ooh, I'm
getting
getting
some
some feedback.
1 second.
Okay, there we go. All right. Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to be able to talk to you this morning for just a few moments. And when thinking about what I wanted to talk about, it was, very important that I focused on something that sometimes is still an issue within Indian country, and that is the concept of having our children taken away. And so before I begin, though, I just want to acknowledge two things. I'll let you know about two things. One, I live in downtown Detroit, which is the land of the Three Fires Council, which is the Ojibwe, Potawatomi, and Odawa peoples. So I just want to honor that. But because I live in a downtown area and there is a home football game today, it's pretty noisy outside my building. So if you hear anything, there's noise going on outside my building. It's like Ford Field is like 2 blocks from where I live. So it's very crazy out there right now. So I want to apologize for that in advance. But I really wanted to take some time this morning and talk about an issue that is super relevant in Indian country, something that, we still continue to fight over. And I love that this part of the program started with that beautiful poem, because I think that poem speaks to the resilience of Indigenous people, and the resilience of the children in our communities, right? So in Canada, they had what were called boarding schools or residential schools. Here in the United States, they were called boarding schools. I am the granddaughter and great granddaughter of boarding school survivors. My grandparents went to religiously run boarding school. My great grandparents went to a government funded run boarding school. So it's very important that I acknowledge their survival of that, because there were so many children that didn't survive. And there were so many children who ended up being forcibly taken from their homes. And that's what I want to spend just a brief moment in time. It's not going to be near enough time, but I want to go through as much as I can to talk to you about some things that have happened in the United States. I believe everything is based in a historical context. And so I want to talk to you about the Indian Child Welfare Act. And we titled this talk, No More Stolen Children, because the reason the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, was created was because Indigenous children were being stolen from their homes. And so one of the ways that the government did this was obviously through the boarding school process. But boarding schools were really there meant to assimilate children. But because children were taken so far away from their homes, it was easy to foster children out and adopt them out and not let their families know about it. So, one of the big things in this country that happened that doesn't get talked about in history class, in mainstream news or talk about it all, is something that was called the Indian Adoption Project. So this was a project that was funded by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, along with the Child Welfare League of North America, and the Adoption Resource Exchange of North America. And the program launched in 1967. Many religious organizations were a part of that. And this is not to say that religion's bad. I don't think that. I think, if you have a calling to practice a certain religion, by all means, please do so. But this is just to talk about how religious organizations were involved in the taking of children. So you had the Mormon Church and the Catholic Church. Those were the two churches that played a huge role. The Mormon Church took thousands of Navajo children and adopted them out to Mormon homes to work on Mormon farms. And the Catholic Church who ran a number of the boarding schools in Canada. They ran about 70% of the residential schools in Canada. They would foster and adopt children out to non-Native families from their schools and not tell their family, like I said earlier. So again, the Indian Adoption Project was funded through the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and the purpose of it was assimilation. It was to solve what the government called this quote Indian problem. It was to make us more, for lack of better phrasing, it was to make us more white and give up our language, our tradition, our ways, our religions, and really assimilate into a Eurocentric society. So up until then, up until the boarding school era, up until the Indian Adoption Project, the motto of the United States was that any good Indian is a dead Indian. So that became too costly because war becomes costly. So that's when the government shifted into boarding schools and then shifted into this Indian Adoption Project. So children were removed from their homes for really no good reason at all. There weren't really home studies that were done. Social workers were just going in, non-native social workers were just going in and taking indigenous children out of their home. And I just wanted to share a couple of things that I read when I was reading interviews from children who had been adopted out. Two children were taken after being in a hospital. One had a rash and one suffered from tuberculosis, so they were removed from their home. Another recalled that they were taken after their father died and their mother didn't want to give them up, so social workers came in and took the child anyway. And then another recalled that they were taken because their grandfather, who practiced traditional ceremony and traditional medicines, refused to give up their traditional ways. So social workers didn't deem that as a quote safe environment for a child to be in. But again, there were no studies, home studies that were done to see if these children were in any harm. So there was a group called the Association on American Indian Affairs, and they caught wind of what was happening. They conducted a national survey and found that 25 to 35% of Native children were being taken from their homes and extended families and being placed in private adoption agencies. They were just being taken away. They also found that non-Native families were using children for farm labor. So it wasn't really to provide them a better home. They were using them for work around their house. There was a number of, things that were going on in Indian country. And so Native leaders started reporting their children missing because they had no clue where they were. They had no clue where they were. They were being taken without being notified. So going back to 1941, the Association on American Indian Affairs found that 85% of Native children had been taken from their homes. 85%. To me, that is astounding. It's it's just that number that it's awesome how 85% of children were being taken. That to me says so many different things. That is the killing of a culture. It's the killing of a people when you're taking 85% of their children. Because how do you change a nation? You start with the children, right? And then it ripples on down generation after generation. So seeing that this was a problem, Congress started to respond. Native, leaders were reaching out to Congress and they started to respond. And they enacted something called the Indian Child Welfare Act, or ICWA. And it was looked at as the best way to protect the interests of Native children and promote the stability of Native nations. So Congress found that there were 4 reasons as to why there were such high rates of Native children being removed. One was a lack of culturally competent state and child welfare standards for assessing fitness of Indian families, meaning that non-Native social workers didn't understand Indigenous culture and they didn't make an effort to understand it. Number 2 was systematic due process violations against Native children and their parents in custody hearings. Parents and family members and tribes weren't being notified of when hearings were happening. That seems something that's so simple, but it wasn't happening. Number three, there were economic incentives favoring the removal of children. The government, mainly the Bureau of Indian Affairs, was literally paying social workers to go in and take children away. And number four, social conditions in Indian country. They were poor and underfunded communities. On the outside, reservations didn't look like good places to raise children, but what they didn't understand and realize is that the child was being raised by a community, right? Reservations may have been poor and underfunded communities, but there was a sense of family that was all across the reservation, and they were actually quite brilliant places to raise children. So because of that, in 1978, Jimmy Carter signs the Indian Child Welfare Act, and there was opposition from states, social welfare groups, and church groups. But he signs it anyways, and it sets a minimum federal standard for nearly all Native children in custody proceedings. It is considered the gold standard of placing children, and there is, four things that they have to follow, and one is providing active efforts to the family, identifying placement that falls under the act, notifying a child's tribe and parents when custody hearings are, and working actively to involve the child's tribe and parents in court proceedings. These seem like very simple things to be done, like common sense, but because they weren't being done before, we had to actually put them in a law. Now, in recent years, as recently as last November 9th to be specific, there have been a number of challenges to the Indian Child Welfare Act by non-Native couples saying that it discriminates against them on the basis of race. But what's really important to understand is being Indigenous, you're not a race. My race is not Indigenous. We are political entities because we are citizens of sovereign nations that are recognized by the federal government. So that is a really big distinction to make. And so in November 9th of last year, there was a case, Brackeen v. Holland, that went in front of the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court heard oral arguments. And one of the things, obviously, you had the sides of, those in Indian country who were defending ICWA, really talking about how it is the gold standard in placement of children, because they want to place children in Native homes, particularly within its tribal nation, its family, other Indigenous people, and then non-Native people. So non-Native people are last on the list. And there was a non-Native couple, a white couple, who felt that they had been discriminated against by not being able to adopt a child that they were fostering, even though when they were told about fostering this child, they were told that they were not going to be able to adopt them, and they accepted that, except when they changed their minds and then decided to sue. So, Texas, the court case started in Texas. It seems everything starts in Texas. So it started in Texas, and then Louisiana and Indiana joined. And Louisiana and Indiana don't have very large Indigenous populations. So I found that really interesting to begin with. But what they did is they went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they argued that it discriminated on the basis of race, and that it took rights away from the state to oversee adoption procedures. But tribal nations are sovereign nations. They don't need the state to oversee them. So it was really talking about who gets a say in the native child's life. And it's really arguing the fact that tribal nations do get a say over what happens to their children. Just like the United States, if you're doing an out of country adoption, we get to say what happens to that child. And a state like Texas doesn't get to tell a state like New York what you get to do in your jurisdiction, right? So what gives a state the right to tell a tribal nation what they get to do within theirs? There was a lot that was at stake. A worst case scenario is that the court rules that it is unconstitutional and it constitutes racial discrimination, and those in tribal nations are given a racial status instead of a political status. If that were to have happened, it would have called into question many federal laws. Federal Indian law would have been challenged. It could have been, there could have been a lot at stake. ICWA was one domino, and if it fell, it could have really crumbled tribal sovereignty to begin with. But in June of this year, when the Supreme Court was rolling out their decisions, as they do, for the court cases that they hear, they did rule that ICWA is constitutional. They upheld it, which was surprising because all of us in Indian country were prepared for them to throw it out, to say it was unconstitutional. So much so that you saw states around the country that were codifying it in their state constitutions. They had some sort of Indian Child Welfare Act on record. That way, if it did go out of go out federally, there was still a way to protect children. But the Supreme Court did rule that ICWA is constitutional. There were two dissenters, but majority did rule that it is constitutional and that states are sovereign entities from the beginning of colonization happening, from the beginning of people. My ancestors met Henry Hudson in 1609 when he came sailing down the river that now bears his name. And so from that moment, the Supreme Court argued that we were sovereign entities. The first treaty that was made with a Native nation between the United States and a Native nation was made in 1778, and that was with the Lenape people. So there's really talking about the importance of Indigenous people, Indigenous sovereignty. And so really the point I wanted to stress today is that even though this was something that was upheld by the Supreme Court, it doesn't mean it can't happen again. ICWA, Indian Child Welfare Act, has been challenged more times than the Affordable Care Act. They continue to come after us. And I also want to point out that the lawyers that were representing the non-Native couples to try to get ICWA overturned was a law firm by the name of Gibson Dunn, who represented the Dakota Access Pipeline during the protests at Standing Rock. Because they wanted to get to that resource-rich land. And tribal reservations sit on resource-rich land. So it is just another way to undermine the sovereignty of Native nations, to continue to steal our children and in a way continue to wipe us out. So I think it's really important that during November, Native American Heritage Month, that we talk about these hard histories that we don't like to talk about, that make us feel uncomfortable, that make us feel icky, for lack of a professional word. They make us feel icky inside. It's important to talk about these because if we don't learn about them and we don't talk about them, history has a tendency to repeat itself. So thank you so much for having me speak to you this morning. I'm glad I could share just a little bit, a tiny bit. We just covered the surface, just a tiny bit of this history. And I continue to thank you for your continued advocacy and being amazing allies. I've always had really good relationships with Unitarian churches. You guys know what's up, and I really appreciate it. So thank you.
So much. I feel you are such a wealth of such important history and information for all of us.